The machine that rolled through the shattered streets weighed 56 tons and carried an 88mm gun that could tear through walls, as if they were made of wet paper, and its thick front armor turned enemy shells into harmless sparks the moment they struck it. And this monster was the Tiger I, a steel predator that dominated the battlefields of the Second World War, and according to every soldier and every manual, a simple civilian woman standing barefoot in a doorway should already have been dead long before the tank even saw her, because no one fights a tiger with kitchen tools. You run or you hide or you vanish under its treads, but on a burning morning in the year 1944, in a city being crushed block by block, she was about to overturn everything that the armies of the world believed about warfare, and she was about to show that something as ordinary as a cast iron skillet worth a handful of coins could bring humiliation to the most feared weapon on earth. But to understand how this impossible act could ever happen, you must understand the terror that the Tiger created by that summer and the grip it held over both armies and civilians alike, for by then a strange paralysis had taken hold among Allied fighters, something the officers called Tiger Fear, a real medical condition where trained men would lose all nerve at the first growl of the Maybach engine that powered this armored giant, because the Tiger never whispered, it roared. And when it roared, the sound rolled through the ground and into the bones of anyone unlucky enough to be nearby, and in the narrow bomb-scarred streets of Warsaw. You felt a tiger long before its shadow arrived, because the water in the gutters trembled and the broken window panes shook against their frames until they shattered, and that sound carried only one meaning: death was approaching the Tiger VI, the Panzer that German engineers created with the goal of making a fortress that moved under its own power, was built with an obsession for invulnerability. Its front plates were 100mm thick slabs of hardened steel that shrugged off Allied rounds like rain bouncing off stone, and the tanks that the British and Americans used, like the Cromwell or the Sherman, had to get close enough to see the color of the paint on the Tiger before they could even hope to damage it. When they tried, the Tiger could destroy them from 2 kilometers away. It could sit calmly at one end of a boulevard and erase everything alive for 20 blocks. And it was created for open fighting for fields wide enough to let it breathe. But by the summer of that violent year, the Germans were using it for a darker purpose. They were using it to suffocate a city, and for the resistance fighters who had no air support, no radios, and no proper armor. Nothing felt more hopeless. These were not trained battalions. They were teachers and carpenters and tailors and teenagers fighting in their everyday clothes with pistols taken from fallen soldiers and old hunting rifles and grenades older than their parents. They were the home army, the AK, and they faced the most mechanized force the world had ever seen. The Tiger made easy work of them. Their bullets pinged off its hide like raindrops. Tapping a barrel Molotov cocktails scorched its paint, but rarely reached the vents. Grenades thrown under its tracks were swallowed by those giant steel plates and crushed before they could explode. And when the turret turned with its slow, steady movement, whole buildings vanished as if swatted aside by a giant hand, and the truth grew bitterly clear. Bravery alone meant nothing. You could not stand fearless in front of 56 tons of metal and expect to change anything. You needed skill or luck or madness. And by August, the city was choking as more German units poured inside special vehicles, like the Sturmtiger firing rocket-powered charges that erased entire buildings in a single blast, and small remote-controlled machines called Goliaths scuttling over rubble to blow apart barricades. And every street seemed to twist into a graveyard as stone and steel piled up around the defenders. And the need for a miracle grew by the hour, but miracles rarely come. So instead, the resistance began turning to desperate science. Improvised science carried out in cellars where dust rained from the ceiling while shells fell overhead. And in those basements, students and workers and anyone with a scrap of chemical knowledge tried to answer one question: how do you kill a tiger without the weapons made for killing tigers? They tried sticky socks filled with explosives coated in thick grease that should have clung to the metal, but the dust of the ruined streets made the grease useless, and the bomb slid off harmlessly as the tank crew cut down the runners. And they tried catapults made from broken furniture to fling fire bottles onto the top deck, but most shattered against the armor and lit nothing but the air. And then came the darkest attempt: children called little tigers sprinting toward armored beasts with blankets and mud, hoping to blind them, only to be cut down before they reached 10 yards. And the hopelessness spread through the fighters as they watched these machines grind through their lines without slowing. and so, when the Maybach engine growled through a street grown silent, every defender checked their last bullet and prepared to choose their own fate. But in the old town district, in the shattered narrow lanes where ash drifted like snow, a woman watched these steel beasts not with terror, but with a strange sharp focus. She was no soldier, she had no rank, no weapon. Training, she was simply a cook known to some later as Magda or the Iron Lady. And while others stared at the barrel, she looked at the back of the creature. And because of that simple difference, she noticed weaknesses that the trained soldiers never saw, and her discovery would become the beginning of a story that no one would have believed possible. The smaller experiments that the resistance attempted were already losing their effect before Magda made her discovery, because the defenders were running out of ideas, and the tanks kept evolving faster than hope itself. The catapult attacks using bottles of burning fuel failed again and again since the engines of the Tiger and the other German machines sat too high for most throws to reach, and when the flames splashed across the thick front armor, all they did was blind the driver for a moment before he pushed forward, crushing barricades and anyone behind them. And then came the heartbreaking attempts by the youngest volunteers, the little tigers who sprinted at these armored beasts with wet rags and blankets, hoping to cover vision slits and confuse the crew. But the Germans adapted faster than anyone expected. They began moving with infantry squads, guarding the front and sides of each tank, and these guards shot down the brave children long before they reached striking distance. And the morale of the resistance slipped once more, because how could untrained civilians stand against armored monsters that seemed capable of adapting to every trick used against them? And when that heavy Maybach engine thundered into a ruined neighborhood, the fighters looked at each other, knowing their bullets would bounce harmlessly, pretending bravery they no longer felt. But Magda, the cook, who had no formal training and no place on any battlefield, saw something the soldiers missed. She watched the tanks from a shattered window 3 floors above, and instead of looking at the lethal barrel, she looked at how the machine moved. She looked at how it breathed, because every machine needs air, and Magda saw the one detail others overlooked. The Tiger needed enormous amounts of oxygen to keep its oversized engine from melting itself to slag, and the vents that fed it were right on the rear deck, wide flat grills that sucked in a river of air every minute. She noticed something else too. The crews were terrified of the narrow alleys that turned their invincible beast into a clumsy blind bull, so they stayed locked inside with every hatch sealed. And when the hatch was closed, a person standing only a few meters away became invisible to them, and Magda understood that the Tiger had 2 weaknesses: blindness and breathlessness, and the idea that would change everything began from an accident rather than design. When a smaller German panzer rolled through a cramped alley hunting a resistance radio team trapped in the upper floors, the defenders had no explosives left and no ammunition to spare. Desperation drove one of them, a young man named Jan, to grab whatever heavy object he could find, and the nearest thing at hand happened to be a cast iron frying pan still shining with the grease from breakfast. He did not aim, he did not think, he simply hurled it out the window with pure frustration, and the pan spun through the air toward the tank below, and by chance or fate it struck the rear deck instead of the turret, landing flat on the hot metal grates, and the grease on its surface prevented it from bouncing off, so it slid neatly across the deck until it wedged itself against the turret, housing exactly over the main air intake, and instantly the engine below began to choke without air. The fuel mixture became too rich, the heat surged, and thick black smoke erupted inside the compartment, and to the terrified crew trapped within the sealed steel box, this meant only one thing: fire, and fire inside a tank is death. They flung open the hatch, climbed out coughing, and surrendered on spot, expecting flames to swallow the machine. But the fighters saw that nothing was burning except the pride of the tank, and sitting innocently on the deck was the greasy iron pan that had suffocated the engine, and word spread through the resistance faster than any planned victory. Most dismissed story as luck, but Magda saw a pattern. She stopped cooking and began studying, and she gathered every scrap of cast iron she could find from abandoned kitchens across the district, because she realized that the pan was more than a heavy object. It was perfectly shaped. It was circular, aerodynamic, and the hollow underside allowed a sticky substance to be spread across its surface, making it cling to metal with enough heat. She gathered young women who served as message runners, women known for their speed and bravery, and she taught them how this kitchen tool could choke the breath from a steel monster. She showed them how to pack the underside with tar or sticky paste, or even a mixture of flour and fuel, when nothing else was available, not always to destroy the tank, but to starve it of air and silence it. But using the pan was no simple task. It required approaching the tank on foot, entering the blind zone, climbing its rear deck, and slamming the pan down before the crew realized what happened. And this was certain death for anyone without courage as strong as iron itself. When volunteers were asked, the men hesitated, but the women stepped forward because the war had already taken everything from them, and they understood that cleverness was their greatest weapon. They practiced in ruined courtyards, learning to vault onto moving trucks, learning the subtle rhythm of the tank, learning exactly when it paused and when it lurched forward. And on the 14th day of August, the test came sooner than expected. The ground trembled as the dreaded King Tiger approached, a machine even heavier than the original Tiger, with sloped armor and even more terrifying presence. And it was rumbling toward the last functioning hospital in the district. The resistance had nothing left, no rocket, no grenades, only Magda, her squad, and the iron pans, and the young runner named Yua, barely more than 20, stood trembling with the heavy skillet in her hands, its underside filled with thick black gunk. And Magda whispered to her to wait for the exact moment when the dust hid her from sight, and the hatch closed shut, blinding the crew. And that moment was seconds away as the King Tiger roared into the street, shaking the rubble with every ponderous step. Inside the roaring King Tiger, the German crew had no idea that a simple household tool was about to turn their mighty fortress into a suffocating tomb. For a long moment, the massive tank rumbled forward, unaware that death in the shape of a black iron circle was inches away from its breath. And when Yua sprinted through the smoke, she knew she had only seconds before the machine gun or the turret found her, but she vanished into the dust cloud and reached the steel flank untouched, gripping the tow cable with both hands and pulling herself onto the scorching back deck as the heat seared through her shoes and rattling vibrations shook her bones. She crawled toward the center where the main intake vent waited, hungry for air. Then, with every ounce of strength in her tired arms, she raised the heavy skillet like a weapon forged in a forgotten forge and slammed it down with a metallic scream that echoed through the ruins, and the sticky tar beneath the pan softened, instantly bonding to the blazing metal and sealing the opening that fed the monster, its lifeblood. And Yua did not stay to witness the results. She rolled off the side, bruising herself on the stones below right as the turret twitched toward her, but the tank never finished its deadly turn, because inside the sealed hull, chaos erupted. The Maybach engine, a mechanical beast consuming rivers of air, suddenly choked as if an invisible hand had wrapped tightly around its throat, and within moments the fuel mixture turned fat. With unburnt gasoline, the pistons misfired violent shocks, jolted the entire frame, and black suffocating smoke surged backward through vents and cracks, pouring directly into the crew cabin. The men inside could barely breathe. They yelled over each other, but the engine was growling, dying, howling with mechanical agony. The temperature inside spiked till it felt like standing inside a furnace, and the choking cloud made the crew certain that their worst nightmare was happening. They believed the tank had been hit by a burning charge, maybe a firebomb or a ruptured fuel line, and in a tank fire there is no bravery, only panic, because they knew that ammunition could cook off in seconds and tear the machine into flying shards. So the commander hammered at the hatch, forcing it open, and the crew stumbled out with their hands up, gasping, stumbling, falling off the deck, with soot staining their faces, surrendering to an empty street because they truly believed the tank would explode. But it never did. It only sat silently, as if stunned by its own defeat, smoking like a furnace that had lost its flame, and the resistance fighters slowly emerged from hiding, staring in disbelief at the immobilize. Beast 1 climbed up and saw the sight that felt too absurd for war. A humble iron frying pan fused to the vent, choking the mightiest armored creation to ever roll through their streets. And that moment did more for the resistance than any weapon they had built before. It shattered the idea that tigers were invincible and filled every fighter with a new kind of courage. But Magda understood this was only the beginning. A single victory might be called luck too, would become a pattern. So she turned a ruined bakery basement into a workshop, a strange factory where the tools of domestic life became weapons of defiance. She gathered women and children and elders, and they scavenged through the ruins collecting cast iron from destroyed apartments, skillets, lids, pot bottoms, anything heavy enough to cover vents or wedge into tracks. And they experimented further, learning that the sticky mixture they used mattered just as much as the pan itself, and they raided old pharmacies and broken hardware shops for anything that could be melted, mixed, or molded into a tar-like paste thick enough to cling, but not so unstable that it exploded while being carried. Magda sketched the designs of different German tanks in a notebook, drawing diagrams of where each one breathed because the Tiger, the Panther, and the Panzer IV all had different vulnerabilities. She created a guide that came to be known among the fighters as the Cookbook, a strange name for a strange war. But the most dangerous part was not making these improvised mines, it was delivering them. So Magda trained the runners in brutal sessions inside the courtyard, sprinting with heavy weights, learning to vault onto moving vehicles, and studying the rhythm of the tank, because the steel giants moved with patterns that could be predicted. Each pause, each turn, each lurch telling the runners when to strike, and Magda taught them the most important rule: if the hatch is open, you are already dead. If the hatch is shut, the beast cannot see you by late August. The German commanders realized something was wrong. Reports reached them describing tanks that had been found abandoned without any sign of proper anti-tank weapons, no rocket holes, no artillery marks, only strange iron discs fused to their vents. Engineers studied them and finally understood someone was using the tank's own immense heat as the weapon. The German response was immediate and merciless. They issued new orders. No tank was to move through the city without a squad of grenadiers marching right beside it, guards who were told to watch the rooftops, the alleys, and especially the blind zones where a runner might hide. These foot soldiers were instructed to shoot anyone carrying anything, and the streets became rivers of danger. The next attempts to use Magda's method ended in tragedy. Runners fell before they reached the tank. Yua watched her friend Zofia cut down as she sprinted toward a panther, a heavy pan slipping from her hand and ringing on the stones. Before the tank crushed both her and the pan beneath its weight, morale cracked. The tactics seemed doomed. The enemy had adapted too well, and Magda sat in a ruined bakery staring at a pile of useless pans, while the women around her waited in silence as the tanks pushed deeper and the hospital came under fire. And Magda studied the broken buildings around them and realized that the city was taller than the streets, and the tanks had only been attacked at ground level. And she spoke the words that changed everything: we do not run to them, we let them come to us. And from that single idea, the next stage of the kitchen war was born, the deadly, silent raining of iron from above. Magda knew the street level had become a killing ground where no runner could survive, and she realized the tanks never looked upward because their crews believed danger lived only at their feet. So she created a new method built on height and gravity, a method more terrifying than anything they had attempted before. She called it the drop, and it demanded perfect timing and absolute courage for it. To work, the fighters needed the tank to stop directly beneath a window or a shattered balcony. And to make that happen, someone had to lure the machine into position. So bait teams took shelter in basements and fired single shots to capture the attention of the armored beasts. And when the tank stopped and turned its turret toward the basement, the upper windows would hold the real strike team. Magda spent days experimenting with the fall of iron objects, because a pan tossed from height had to land flat or it would bounce uselessly off the armored hide. And through trial and error, she discovered that tying cloth strips to the handle created a tail that controlled the descent, guiding the pan into a steady spin that flipped it into the correct position so the sticky side landed down on vent. And this discovery was tested on a day that none of the women present would ever forget. 3 German tanks moved cautiously down Kolinsky Street, the infantry guarding both sides with rifles raised, and every doorway and alley checked for threats, because the Germans had already learned dangers hidden at ground level. But they never imagined that death might fall from above. Magda and Yua waited on the 3rd floor of a ruined apartment block, without walls, without safety. And with the shattered floor sagging beneath their boots, the lead tank rumbled closer, the steel tracks grinding stone into dust, and the infantry scanned every shadow on the street level. But they did not raise their eyes because they believed they had already secured the only angle that mattered. Magda held the pan, a heavy iron disc packed with gunk and sticky paste, and she knew she had just one chance. The bait team across the street fired a single shot, and the tank stopped instantly. Its turret swung toward the basement like a giant head snapping to face an insect. And for one frozen moment, the machine stood motionless. Yor watched Magda lean outward, gripping the edge of the broken wall for balance, and instead of throwing the pan, she simply let it fall. And for 2 long seconds, the iron disc dropped spinning slowly, and the cloth tail twisted in the air, guiding it into position before the heavy iron struck the engine louver with a sharp echo that bounced between the ruined buildings and startled. Even the grenadiers guarding the sides and the sticky substance beneath the pan softened at once from the heat and clung tightly, sealing the vent and choking the engine before the crew even realized anything was wrong. Yet Magda did not stop there, because she had prepared a hidden ambush the moment the first pan landed. She shouted now, and across the entire street women appeared at shattered windows and broken ledges, releasing their own iron weapons into the air like a storm of metal falling upon the tanks. And the second tank took a hit directly on its turret ring, jamming the mechanism, so the gunner tried to turn the barrel, and the gears screeched and locked, making the weapon useless. The third tank reversed in fear, but the driver misjudged the rubble behind him, and the machine climbed onto a broken mound and through a track, twisting sideways like a wounded beast, while the infantry fired blindly at the windows, unable to hit targets that had already vanished into the labyrinth above. And suddenly, the unstoppable German column stood broken in the street, with the first tank choking on smoke, the second unable to aim, and the third crippled. The armored advance had been stopped by gravity and kitchen supplies, and the resistance watched in awe as the tanks that once ruled the streets now sat helpless like beasts caught in a trap. But victory brought consequences. The Germans reacted with fury, for they understood that the city itself had become the weapon, and they could no longer trust any floor or window, and so they summoned their air support, the dreaded Stuka dive bombers that shrieked like falling demons as they descended from the sky. These planes began flattening the upper stories of entire blocks, destroying the height advantage that Magda had used so brilliantly, and soon, bakery that served as the ironworks was hit and buried under mountains of stone and dust, and the women crawled out, wounded, choking, bleeding, but still alive. Yet they knew the air raids had stripped them of their greatest tool. And Yor asked Magda, "What can we do now? We have no workshop and no high ground." And Magda looked at the ruined streets, then at the manholes, and she gave the answer that birthed the next evolution of their desperate war. She said, "We still have the sewers," and with that a new battlefield opened beneath the feet of the Germans, because if the tanks could not be attacked from the street or from the sky, then the fight would rise up from the darkness below, and the sewers of Warsaw, foul and narrow and filled with sludge, became the final refuge and the final laboratory of Magda's resistance. For though the city above was burning, the ground beneath it would soon become a grave for armored giants, and the next chapter of the Kitchen War would unfold in the shadows where light and hope barely survived. The sewers of Warsaw were never meant to carry hope, yet by late summer they had become the only passage the resistance could still claim as their own, because while the Germans ruled the sky and crushed the streets with tanks, they held no power beneath the ground, and Magda understood that this dark world of sludge and tunnels could be turned into a weapon, just as she had turned frying pans into mines. The tanks above had thick armor on every surface, except one, the belly, and to move through the broken city, each tank had to cross iron manhole covers that connected to the tunnels below, and so Magda gathered the women and the few men still strong enough to work, and they took the last of the cast iron pans saved from the shattered bakery and dragged them into the sewers, guided by dying flashlight beams and the distant tremble of explosions overhead. And in that suffocating darkness, with the stench of a dying city rolling over them, they began shaping the next generation of their improvised weapons. Each pan was packed with whatever explosives they had left, bits of dynamite stolen from collapsed walls, powder scraped from old shells, tar used as adhesive gunk that held everything together, and Magda shaped these charges so the force would blast upward like a cone of fire, punching straight into the weakest part of any tank that passed above them. The plan was terrifying because it required a spotter sitting beneath a manhole cover, listening for tank treads and waiting for the exact moment when the massive machine rolled over the plate, blocking the tiny slivers of light and covering the tunnel in complete darkness. And only then could the spotter lift the pan upward, wedge it against the underside of the tank, and light the fuse before diving back into the sludge, praying the blast would not crush them as the concussion tore through the tunnel. It was a gamble with death played every time a tank crossed the street, yet it worked more cleanly than anyone expected on the second day of September. A panther guarding the old town approached one of these manholes, and as it rolled over the steel circle, the ground above shook, and the spotter did not hesitate. They shoved the pan upward right into the thin armor beneath the engine, and triggered the fuse, and the explosion that followed tore through the belly of the tank, blasting a hole big enough to ignite the ammunition. Within, the turret lifted from the hull in a burst of flame and smoke, rising like a broken crown, while the infantry nearby shouted in confusion, because there were no enemy fighters in sight, no rockets, no grenades, and yet the tank had destroyed itself, the ground had attacked them, and fear spread through the German crews faster than fire, because now even the streets they trusted were treacherous. They began avoiding manholes, swerving awkwardly through the rubble, which slowed their advance, and exposed them to sniper fire, but Magda knew this victory like the ones before it would provoke. Another brutal response, and the cost of each success cut their numbers down, because for every tank they stopped, 2 more arrived, and for every runner or spotter who survived, 3 others died in tunnels or under debris or from gas attacks that seeped into the sewers as the Germans tried to suffocate the fighters below. The uprising was losing its strength, the old town was collapsing, and by late September the order came to retreat to the city center through the sewer network, and this final journey was something out of nightmare. Thousands of civilians, wounded fighters and children crawled through waist-deep filth for hours, pushing toward the only exit that was still under resistance control, and that exit at Krasinski Square was about to be crushed because a column of German armor led by a monstrous Sturmtiger was rumbling toward it. The Sturmtiger was a fortress on track, firing rocket-propelled depth charges strong enough to erase buildings, and if it reached the sewer entrance, it would collapse the tunnel and trap thousands inside, sealing their fate. Forever, Magda and Ewa realized they had only one weapon left, one final pan, battered and scarred, packed with the last mixture of tar and stolen dynamite, and they had no high ground left to perform a drop, no sewer access, because the tunnels behind them were filled with fleeing families, and no support teams, only broken ruins and the distant roar of the Sturmtiger. Drawing closer, Magda looked at Ewa and placed a worn notebook in her hands, the cookbook containing diagrams of every tank weak point, every placement angle, every trick she had learned through months of desperate fighting. And she told Ewa to take it to the city center to teach the others, because someone had to carry the knowledge forward, and Ewa refused at first, wanting to stay, but Magda pushed her toward the manhole, telling her that the story of their fight mattered as much as the fight itself. And Ewa descended into the darkness, carrying the book, while Magda stepped into the ruined street, alone, tightening the cloth around the handle of the last iron pan as the Sturmtiger rolled into the square, searching for the sewer entrance. It ignored the lone woman in the dust because she looked too small to matter. But Magda did not hide, she did not flee, she waited until the monster turned its huge launcher toward the escaping civilians. Then she charged. Bullets tore through the dirt around her, and one struck her leg, but she kept moving, driven by nothing but willpower and rage. She reached the treads, but had no strength to climb, so she did the only thing she could. She jammed the iron pan into the gap between the drive sprocket. The track cast iron that could crack yet resist incredible pressure for a few precious seconds, and the massive force of the engine strained against the pan until the drive pin snapped, and the track unraveled like a broken chain. The Sturmtiger jerked sideways and smashed into a wall, blocking the street behind it, and the tanks following could not pass, and the infantry could not advance. And the civilians in the sewers escaped because Magda bought them 20 minutes, and 20 minutes was enough to save 1,000 lives. Magda fell beside the broken track of the Sturmtiger, unable to rise and unable to see the final result of her sacrifice, as the echoes of the collapsing machine rolled through the ruined square, and somewhere beneath her feet, deep in the tunnels, the refugees kept crawling toward safety, unaware that a single battered frying pan had just bought the minutes they desperately needed. And when the last of them passed through the sewer entrance, the Germans finally pushed forward, only to find their path blocked by the crippled Sturmtiger and a narrow street choked with wreckage. And by the time they cleared it, the refugees were long gone, leaving the old town behind to its fate. And the uprising that had held for 2 months was now collapsing under the full weight of the occupying forces. The defenders had no more hospitals, no ammunition, no supplies, and no safe ground to stand on. And in early October, the resistance made the impossible decision to surrender, knowing that if they continued to fight, the entire civilian population would be exterminated. And on the second day of October, the uprising ended, and the Germans carried out the order they had been waiting, for they began destroying what remained of Warsaw, block by block, building by building, blasting apart the homes of thousands, until more than 8/10 of the city lay in ruins, a sea of shattered brick and blackened stone where streets once stood. And amid this devastation, Ewa survived, having followed the refugees through the sewer passage and later finding herself taken to a prisoner camp with nothing but the clothes she wore. And the little greased notebook Magda had forced into her hands, the notebook filled with diagrams, formulas, and notes that told the strange, impossible story of how one cook had turned iron skillets into weapons capable of stopping the most advanced armor in the world. And after the war ended, when the Soviets marched into the wreckage, they suppressed the truth of the uprising because the regime wanted no heroes from the home army, no symbols of independent resistance, and the stories of Magda and her kitchen warriors faded into whispers spoken only in private homes and late-night gatherings. When trust felt safe, the tanks involved were melted down years later, their wrecked hulks forgotten in scrap yards, and the broken pans scattered across the city were collected and reused forged into pipes, nails, tools, anything the rebuilding demanded, and the traces of the kitchen war vanished from the physical world. But memory does not vanish so easily. Military historians studying the battle decades later were bewildered by the number of German heavy tanks listed as immobilized due to mysterious mechanical failures in Sector 4, and they blamed poor engine reliability, bad supply lines, or simple exhaustion of the machines, all while the real cause lay unspoken in the shadows because no one outside the survivors knew about the pans. And when the Iron Curtain finally fell, archives opened in the early years of the last decade of the 20th century. Fragments of truth began to surface, diaries written in cramped handwriting, letters that mentioned strange iron plates fused to tank vents, reports that never reached Berlin. And finally, Ewa, now an elderly woman living in Chicago, released her memoir telling how Magda formed squads, taught them to strike from above, from the sides, and finally from beneath, and how the city itself became a weapon shaped by the will of women who refused to surrender. She shared the sketches from the notebook, the drawings of Tiger vents, Panther louvers, and Panzer intakes, maps that marked which angle the pan must be placed, diagrams for the sewer mines, and the written line that appeared at the bottom of every page: "Everything is a weapon when you have no choice." And historians at last understood that the failures in the German armored columns were not mechanical accidents, but deliberate acts of sabotage carried out with nothing more than courage and cast iron. And today, when people speak of modern war, they speak of drones, lasers, cyber weapons, and machinery more complex than anything the world of 1944 could imagine. And they assume that advanced technology always holds the upper hand, but Magda's story stands as a timeless answer to that belief. A reminder that the stronger and more complex a machine becomes, the more fragile it may grow, because power often hides blind spots, and the Tiger tank, for all its engineering brilliance, had a single overlooked weakness: it needed to breathe. And a woman with no formal training simply removed its breath. The women of the old town did not change the outcome of the uprising. The city fell, and their people were scattered, but they shattered the illusion of invincibility that surrounded the German armor. They proved that resistance, even when hopeless in scale, was never meaningless, because every tank halted meant a child reached safety, every vent sealed meant a family crawled through the sewers in time, every minute bought was a minute that saved a life. And though the rebuilt old town of Warsaw holds monuments to soldiers and commanders, none hold statues of women gripping frying pans, yet the walls still bear faint marks from shells and bullets. And if you walk those streets and listen closely, you might imagine the ground trembling under the weight of distant tracks, and hear in the echoes a single metallic clang, the sound of iron striking steel, the sound of courage defying a king. The final weeks of the uprising faded beneath layers of dust and ash as Warsaw collapsed into a ruin wider than sight and deeper than memory. And though the guns finally fell silent on the second day of October in the year 1944, the silence carried no relief for resistance fighters or the civilians who had endured 2 months of unbroken terror and destruction, because surrender did not bring mercy. It brought punishment as the occupying forces carried out their orders to erase the city itself block by block, until nearly the entire old town lay flattened into broken stone and twisted iron, and yet the legacy of Magda and the women who fought beside her refused to vanish even when the city was burned to its bones for Yua, survived the final retreat through the darkness of the sewers, stepping into captivity with nothing but her torn clothing and the small greased notebook pressed against her ribs, a notebook that carried the knowledge of a strange war waged with iron skillets, tar, and pure defiance. She kept the book hidden through the long months in the prisoner camp, guarding it with a devotion that surprised even her, because she knew the world would lose their story if the notebook died with her, and when the war at last ended and foreign armies swept through the ruins, maps were redrawn, leaders replaced, and banners changed, yet the stories of the home army did not rise with the new era, for the new regime had no desire to honor a resistance, had not controlled, and so Magda's tale and the tales of her kitchen fighters were buried beneath official reports and rewritten histories, and the courage of thousands slipped into whispered memory, shared only in the dim light of kitchens where families still remembered the sound of tanks crushing their streets. The years past the tanks rusted, the ruins rose again as new structures stood where entire neighborhoods had once burned, and the iron pans once wielded as weapons were melted down and reforged into beams and pipes that supported the new city, and in doing so the physical evidence of the strange war vanished, yet the questions remained in the minds of historians who studied the battle for decades afterward, men who could not understand why so many heavily armored vehicles failed in Sector 4 without any sign of proper anti-tank fire, and they blamed engine flaws, bad fuel, inexperience, anything except the truth, because the truth sounded too impossible to believe, and only when the old political barriers broke, and the archives opened in the final decade of the 20th century, did glimpses of the real story emerge, first from fragments of diaries that survived fires, mentions of improvised charges and strange discs found on tank vents, then from photographs taken secretly by resistance, members showing soot-covered crew members stumbling out of tanks without visible damage, then finally from a woman living quietly in Chicago who revealed a notebook she had carried across the world and held hidden for half a lifetime. Yua's memoir stunned the researchers as she described each stage of Magda's impossible campaign, from the first accidental pan that silenced a panzer to the calculated design of the Magda mine, to the terrifying leaps onto the backs of armored beasts, to the deadly precision of the drop technique and the sewer ambushes that turned the ground itself into a weapon. She explained how Magda sketched every tank type in her notebook, identifying the lungs of each machine, the points where air flowed, where metal thinned, where the giant revealed their unseen fragility, and these sketches at last explained the mysterious failures in the German records tanks, listed as abandoned, no enemy fire, no visible damage, only a note that the engine seized, or the ventilation malfunctioned, or the crew fled without warning. And the world learned the truth that the most fearsome symbol of armored warfare had been humbled not by rockets or artillery, but by women wielding the tools of ordinary life, who refused to accept that they were powerless in a world ruled by steel and fire. And as this truth reached historians, soldiers, and ordinary people, it reshaped how they viewed the uprising, not as a doomed revolt, but as a testament to what creativity and courage can achieve when every conventional weapon is gone. For the lesson of Magda's war was not about victory because the city still fell and thousands still perished. The lesson was about resistance itself, about the power of refusing to surrender even when defeat seems certain, because every second bought by Magda's pans allowed someone to flee every disabled tank, slowed a column long enough for a family to escape every act of courage in those haunted streets, preserved a thread of humanity in a world bent on erasing it. And today, when visitors walk through the rebuilt old town, they see proud buildings painted in bright colors. They see tourists and children and quiet streets that seem far removed from the inferno of 1944, yet hidden in the walls there are still faint scars from shells and machine gun bursts, reminders carved into stone that the past is closer than it seems. And if one stands still and listens beneath the murmur of crowds, it is almost possible to hear the distant growl of a Maybach engine rolling through a ruined square, and woven into that Echo is another sound, softer yet more powerful, the sharp ringing clang of cast iron striking steel, the sound of Magda and the women of Warsaw, defying an empire with nothing but courage and a frying pan. And though no statue stands for them, their story lives each time history whispers that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary truths, and that even the mightiest machines can fall when met by those who refuse to bow. The story of how a simple piece of kitchen iron humbled the most feared steel beasts of the Second World War should have been shouted across nations, yet for decades it lived only in the quiet corners of memory where survivors whispered their truths to one another, because the world that emerged after the war had little room for the tales of ordinary people who fought with whatever tools they could grasp, and so Magda's legacy nearly vanished beneath Ash's propaganda. And the slow erosion of time, but history, has a way of clawing to the surface when the world is ready to listen. And by the final years of the 20th century, scholars digging through forgotten archives began noticing strange patterns in German reports from the Warsaw sector. Heavy tanks, abandoned without any sign of shaped charges, or cannon fire Panther crews, fleeing from engines that suddenly suffocated or burst in black smoke. King Tigers rendered immobile, even though no weapon on the battlefield should have breached their armor, and these discrepancies puzzled researchers until by then, an elderly woman stepped forward holding the worn notebook that Magda had pressed on her during the final hours of uprising. The little book was stained with tar, soot, and water damage, yet the diagrams inside were clear enough, showing vent placements, weak points, airflow paths, drawn in hurried lines by a woman who understood that every machine, no matter how mighty, must breathe. Explained the evolution of iron pan tactic, how it began by accident when a skillet slipped across the deck of a Panzer and clogged its vent, how Magda refined the method in a ruined bakery, turning cast iron cookware into improvised mines, how the women of the district practiced running, climbing, and striking while bullets tore apart the streets around them, how the drop from upper windows was invented, and how the sewer mines transformed the darkness beneath the city into a battlefield more terrifying than anything above ground. And as these revelations reached historians, they understood that the resistance in Warsaw had fought not only with rifles and Molotovs, but with invention and audacity, and that the German armored divisions had been slowed for days by household tools wielded by civilians who refused to bow to despair. And this knowledge changed the way many saw the uprising no longer as a doomed revolt, but as one of the most remarkable demonstrations of human creativity under extreme pressure, because the truth is that Magda and her fighters knew they could not win the war, but they fought to win minutes, and sometimes minutes matter more than miles. Each disabled tank gave a family time to flee, each stalled column allowed wounded fighters to be moved, each moment seized from the jaws of the enemy meant life instead of death for someone hiding in the rubble. And that is the real weight of Magda's legacy, not that she defeated an army, but that she carved small intervals of safety inside a storm meant to erase everything. And as Warsaw rebuilt itself after the war, rising from rubble like a city reborn, the physical traces of the kitchen war were melted down or buried beneath new streets. Yet echoes of the past endured in stories shared among families, and in the scars on the old walls where shell strikes still pitted the stone. And though there is no statue of a woman holding a frying pan, the truth lives on in every retelling of that struggle, because it reminds the world that bravery does not always come from soldiers or from those carrying weapons forged in factories. Sometimes it comes from people who never imagined they would fight yet stand up when no one else can. And in these retellings, the message is always the same: technology alone does not determine victory, strength does not guarantee survival, and even the most advanced machine can fall before the will of those who refused to break. The Germans built the Tiger to be invincible. They built the King Tiger to dominate any battlefield, yet all their engineering brilliance faltered when confronted by one overlooked detail: the simple necessity of air that keeps every engine alive. Magda found that weakness not through training but through observation and instinct, a clarity that came from surviving day after day in a world that tried to crush her. And she turned that clarity into action, transforming a common frying pan into a symbol of defiance. Many decades later, visitors to Warsaw walk through a city that no longer bears the wounds of 1944, yet the spirit of those who fought lingers in the air, a reminder of what was endured and what was lost. And if one stands in the old town square at dusk and closes their eyes, they might imagine the distant rumble of treads, the scraping of metal against Stone and layered atop that sound the sharp ringing clang that once echoed through the narrow streets, a single piece of iron defying a giant, a reminder that no matter how dark a moment may seem, there is always a way to resist and a way to fight back, even with something as simple and unexpected as a frying pan. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.